The first time Clara Hutchinson laid eyes on the man bleeding out in the Nebraska snow, she knew one of them wasn't going to survive the winter. She just didn't know in that moment that it was probably going to be her. His breath punched white holes in the December air, little frozen prayers. He was slumped against a cottonwood, three dark flowers blooming on his buckskin shirt. Bullet holes. Fresh ones. His eyes flickered open, and in them, she saw a man who had already made his peace with death. Alone, proud, facing the rising sun. It was a look Clara knew well. She'd buried her own husband, Thomas, just 6 months before. She recognized that terrible calm that comes when the fighting is over, when you've already given up. But her hands, they had other ideas. They were already moving, tearing a strip from her petticoat, pressing the clean cloth against the worst of the wounds. She heard her own voice, calm and steady, the one she used on spooked horses. "Not today," she said to him, to the prairie, to God. "Not on my land." He was Lakota. The beadwork on his moccasins told her that. The way his hair was braided, even matted with blood. The reservation was 40 miles north, a place of slow starvation and broken promises. But a cold knot in her stomach told her he hadn't come from there. No, this man was running from something far worse. She tried to lift him. He let out a groan, a sound like grinding stones, and then he spoke, in perfect, startling English. "Leave me, white woman. I am already walking the spirit trail." But Clara had hauled 100-pound feed sacks in blizzards. She'd birthed calves in the dead of night with nothing but a lantern and grit. She wasn't about to let a man die 50 yards from her cabin just because he'd lost his nerve. "You can walk wherever you please once you're healed," she grunted, heaving his dead weight over her shoulder. "Until then, you're walking to my house." Her cabin was a lonely little box on 160 acres of nothing. After Thomas died of fever, it felt even smaller. 2 rooms, a lean-to for the horse, and walls chinked with mud and grass against a wind that never ever stopped. But it was hers. She'd built the second room herself that fall, planning for the children she and Thomas would never have. Now into that empty room she dragged this stranger, this fugitive, this man the papers would call a hostile, an enemy. His blood soaked into the new mattress, ticking, and she had a fleeting thought of Thomas. He would have been horrified. He would have ridden straight to Fort Robinson and turned him in without a second thought. But Thomas was in the ground, and Clara was learning that the dead don't get a vote. She worked through the night, a grim surgeon in a lamplit cabin. She cleaned the wounds with carbolic acid that made him thrash and cry out in his delirium. 2 bullets had gone clean through. One in the shoulder, another tore a ragged path along his ribs. But the third was still in there, lodged deep beneath his shoulder blade, nestled up against his spine. She knew, with a homesteader's certainty, that trying to get it out would kill him faster than the infection would. She packed the wounds with clean linen and honey from her lone hive, an old remedy her grandmother swore by. When the pale winter dawn finally seeped through the oiled paper windows, his breathing had steadied. A fever was raging, painting his skin with a sheen of sweat. Clara sat in the chair beside the bed, her heavy Henry rifle resting across her lap. She wasn't sure if she was protecting him from the world or protecting herself from him. He woke on the third day. His eyes were clear. They focused first on the rifle, then on her face. There was no gratitude in them, only a cold, hard anger. "You should have let me die," he rasped. Clara was at the stove, heating bone broth. She didn't turn around. "Maybe so," she said, her voice flat, "but I didn't. So now we both have to live with it." She brought him the cup. His hands were too weak to hold it steady, so she fed him. Spoonful by spoonful, patient and careful, just as she had been with Thomas in his last days. The memory was a fresh stab of pain. "Why?" he asked between sips, his eyes never leaving her face, searching for something. Clara considered all the easy lies: Christian duty, a woman's compassion, the simple kindness of a stranger. Instead, she told him the truth, because she was too tired for anything else. "Because I'm tired of death," she said, meeting his gaze. "This year has brought me nothing but endings." He studied her then, really looked at her. He saw the lines around her eyes that shouldn't be there on a woman her age. He saw the calluses on her hands, rough as bark. He saw the plain gold wedding band she still wore on her finger. "You are alone," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a mirror. "As are you," she replied, and in that moment, something shifted between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. An alliance of the broken. But she was wrong. They weren't just two lonely people. She had brought a war to her doorstep, and the first soldiers were already on their way. He told her his name was Joseph Crow Feather, but he admitted it was a name for the white man, easy to pronounce, easy to dismiss. His real name was something else, something he kept locked away. He'd been to their schools. Carlisle, torn from his family at 7 years old, sheared like a sheep, and beaten for speaking his own tongue. They said they were killing the Indian to save the man, he told her one evening, his voice devoid of emotion, as she changed his bandages. But you cannot kill only part of something. You kill it all, or you kill nothing. He'd escaped at 15 and found his way home, but home was gone. He was a ghost, stuck between two worlds, belonging to neither. The bullets had come from soldiers. He didn't deny it. He'd been caught bringing supplies, food, medicine, to a small band of holdouts, people who refused to go to the reservation to die slowly. "They call us hostiles," he said with a bitter twist of his lips, "as if we were the ones who came uninvited to someone else's home." A sensible woman would have been terrified. Clara knew that. Harboring a fugitive, an enemy of the state, her nearest neighbor, a hard-faced Scot named John Mackenzie, lived 5 miles east. He was a man who followed the rules, a man who would gladly turn Joseph in for a bounty and a pat on the head from the army. But as the December days bled into one another, Clara found she wasn't afraid. She was interested. Joseph was nothing like her Thomas. Thomas was a good man, a simple man. His world was corn, cattle, and the Bible. Joseph, on the other hand, could quote Shakespeare. He could discuss German philosophers. He'd read more books than the preacher in town, but he spoke of them with a weary cynicism, as if he'd picked them apart and found them hollow. "Your philosophers speak of the rights of men," he said one night, wincing as she helped him sit up. "But they only mean certain men, men who look like them." Clara had no answer. Her own schooling had stopped at 14, but she wasn't a fool. She'd seen the settlers celebrating Custer's death, and then she'd seen their righteous fury, their calls for total extermination. "We're all hypocrites," she said finally, her voice low. "The trick is trying to be less of one each day." His eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of respect. As he got stronger, he started helping, mending a broken harness, sharpening her axe until it could split a hair. His hands were clever, efficient. He taught her things. How to read the weather in the flight of a hawk, which roots could soothe a cough and which could stop a heart. He taught her Lakota words, Winyan for woman, Thiwahe for family, Washteleka for love. He stumbled over that last one, a faint blush rising on his high cheekbones. She, in turn, taught him to make sourdough. His first loaf was a disaster, a flat, dense brick. He held it up, a wry smile on his face. "Even my failures feed someone," he said, and broke it into pieces for her chickens. In these small moments, a fragile peace grew between them, a lightness that felt dangerous, like laughing in church. They were two people living in the shadow of a hanging tree, and yet they found themselves smiling. They were forgetting to be afraid. And that was the most dangerous thing of all, because the real threat wasn't miles away at some fort. It was just over the next rise. It was her neighbor, John Mackenzie. And he hadn't just been a neighbor to her husband. He'd been his business partner, a partnership that had ended very, very badly. The blizzard hit on Christmas Eve. It came down from the north like a screaming white devil, a fury of wind and ice that made the little cabin groan and shake. Clara had seen storms like this before. They could wipe out whole herds of cattle, freeze a family solid in their beds. This was a killer storm. She worked with grim efficiency, her movements practiced and sure. Chickens into the kitchen, squawking in protest. Her old horse into the tight space behind the lean-to's inner wall. She banked the fire in the stove, calculating how much wood they had, how long it had to last. Joseph, though it clearly pained him, refused to sit idle. He helped her secure the shutters, his breath misting in the frigid air inside the cabin. They moved together, a silent, coordinated dance of survival. In that shared work, Clara felt a sense of partnership she hadn't realized how much she'd missed. It was different from how it was with Thomas. That had been assumed, expected. This was chosen. This was necessary. Near midnight, the heart of the storm hit. The temperature plummeted so fast that ice began to creep across the inside of the walls. Joseph looked at her, his face serious in the flickering lamplight. "We need to share warmth," he said, his voice low and steady. "This cold will kill us separately." She knew he was right. She also knew what the world would say about a white widow sharing a bed with an Indian man. The scandal, the outrage. But the world wasn't here. Propriety was a luxury for people who weren't about to freeze to death. Survival was all that mattered. They lay down on her rope bed, fully clothed, back to back. The only sound was the howling of the wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. She could feel the heat of his body seeping through the layers of wool and cotton, a small pocket of life in a world of killing cold. When morning came, they were alive. Frost had crystallized on the quilt where their breath had frozen. The world outside was a silent, white tomb. Joseph turned to face her. In the pale, eerie light filtering through the frosted-over window, she saw something in his eyes that was more terrifying than the storm. It was a look of raw, unguarded emotion. "Clara," he said, her name a soft sound in the stillness, "there is something I must tell you." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She braced herself. "I am not just any Lakota," he said, his eyes holding hers. "My father is a chief. He leads one of the last free bands. The army, they will never stop hunting me. Not just for running, for who I am." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. She finally understood. She hadn't just saved a man. She'd sheltered a symbol, a leader. She'd painted a target on her own back, big enough for the entire U.S. Army to see. "Are you trying to scare me away?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I am trying to be honest," he said. "You deserve that much." Honesty. She thought of Thomas. He'd been honest too. Honest about his dreams for this land, his plans for their family. All those honest plans were now buried under 6 feet of frozen prairie. "I'm not afraid," she said. And the strangest part was, she meant it. The blizzard raged for 3 solid days, trapping them in the tiny cabin, in a world that consisted only of each other. The forced intimacy broke down the last of their walls. They talked, truly talked, in a way Clara never had with anyone, not even Thomas. Joseph told her of his world, of the sun dance and vision quests, of a spiritual life so deep and complex she could only grasp the edges of it. But she recognized its power, its sacredness. In return, she unspooled the bleak story of her own life. Growing up in Ohio, the daughter of a drunk who drank himself into an early grave. Her mother had followed him 6 months later. The doctor called it grief. Clara, who had seen the relief in her mother's eyes after the funeral, knew better. It was the exhaustion of a long, thankless battle finally being over. They began to talk about the future, tiptoeing around it at first, then striding right into it. "This land won't stay like this," Joseph said, staring into the fire. "More will come. The railroad is coming. They will squeeze my people onto smaller and smaller patches of useless land until we are just a memory." She wanted to tell him he was wrong, but she couldn't. She'd seen the surveyor's stakes herself, driven into the prairie grass like nails in a coffin lid. She'd heard the talk in town. Progress. Destiny. "Where will you go?" she asked. "North," he said. "Canada, perhaps. Some of our people have found a measure of peace there." He paused and the air thickened. "You could come." The offer hung there between them, a fragile bridge over a bottomless canyon. To leave this place, this cabin she'd built with her own 2 hands, this piece of earth that was the first thing she had ever truly owned. To leave Thomas's grave, marked by a crude wooden cross she'd carved herself. It was unthinkable. I need to think," she stammered. He nodded, his face unreadable. "Time is the one thing we may not have. When this snow melts, someone will come, either for me or for you." They both knew what that meant. For him, a rope or a bullet. For her, arrest, her land seized, her name dragged through the mud until she was an outcast, a pariah, a squaw lover, the ugliest word they had. And yet, lying beside him in the dark, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, she found she couldn't summon a single shred of concern for her reputation. The world that cared about such things had already taken everything from her. Why should she care what it thought now? The thaw began on New Year's Day. The world started dripping. Joseph was stronger now, walking without help. But the bullet was still in him, a permanent piece of the white man's world he would carry to his grave. They stood at the window watching the snow recede, knowing that with every drop of melting water, their time was running out. "I love you," he said, just like that. The words dropped into the quiet room, simple and devastating. "I have no right, but I do." Clara turned to look at him. She saw it all in his face. The danger, the impossibility, the thousand reasons this was madness. A white woman and a Lakota chief's son. It was a death sentence. "I love you too," she heard herself say, because it was the truth, and she was done with pretending that just surviving was the same as being alive. But she also knew that love, no matter how true, couldn't stop a bullet. That night, she couldn't sleep. She bundled up and walked out to Thomas's grave. The cross was listing, pushed over by the heavy snow. She tried to conjure his face, his voice. "What would you do, Thomas? What would you tell me to do?" But the only answer was the lonely sigh of the wind across the plains. When she returned to the cabin, the lamp was lit. Joseph was sitting at the small table. Laid out in front of him were his few possessions: a knife, a leather medicine bag, and a small, worn photograph of a woman and a young boy. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't let herself ask, hadn't let herself consider it. "Your family," she said, her voice flat. He looked up, his eyes filled with a grief so profound it was like a physical blow. He nodded slowly. "My wife, Mourning Dove, and my son, Little Hawk." He paused, and his next words were ice. "They were murdered at Wounded Knee." The name of the massacre hung in the air, a stain that would never wash out. It had been 5 years, but for him, it was yesterday. It would always be yesterday. Clara sat down opposite him. She finally understood. They weren't just survivors. They were ghosts, both of them, haunted by the people they had lost. "We're not trying to replace them," she said softly. He looked at the photograph, his thumb tracing the faded image of his son. "No," he said, "but perhaps we can help each other carry the weight." A shadow fell across the doorway just 3 days later. John Mackenzie. He wasn't alone. He had two other men with him, strangers with hard eyes and rifles held too casually. Joseph saw them first. He was already moving for his own rifle when Clara put a hand on his arm. "No," she whispered. "Let me handle this. Please." She went to the door, positioning her body to block the view of the room behind her. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, her voice even. "Mrs. Hutchinson." He tipped his hat, but his eyes were cold, scanning, searching. "We heard a rumor that some hostile buck got himself shot up around here. Army's offering a handsome reward for any information." Clara kept her face a placid mask. It was a skill she'd learned young. "I haven't seen a soul," she said, her tone light. "Just been snowed in, same as everyone." Mackenzie's gaze flickered past her, trying to pierce the shadows of the cabin. "You all alone out here? Not safe for a woman these days." She allowed herself a small, tight smile. "I've got my Henry rifle, Mr. Mackenzie, and I know how to use it." She let the threat hang in the air. The two men with him shifted uncomfortably. Mackenzie held her gaze for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Well," he said, tipping his hat again, "if you see anything unusual, you let us know." They rode off, and the moment they were over the rise, Clara's knees gave out. She slumped into a chair, her hands shaking so violently she had to clench them in her lap. Joseph knelt beside her, taking her trembling hand in his own. His were warm and steady. "You see," he said gently, "this is how it would be. Always. Hiding, lying, looking over your shoulder." She looked up at him, and he saw the fear in her eyes turn to something else. something hard and defiant. "I've been afraid my whole life," she said, her voice shaking with sudden fury. "Afraid of my father, afraid of being poor, afraid of being alone. I'm done letting fear make my choices for me." But this wasn't just fear. This was Mackenzie. And Clara knew something Joseph didn't. Mackenzie wasn't just some nosy neighbor. He knew this land. He knew this cabin. And he knew her husband Thomas had been keeping a secret. A secret buried right under the floorboards of the room where Joseph now slept. A secret worth killing for. Their plan was desperate, a long shot stitched together with hope. Joseph would leave first, head north alone, travel fast, and try to reach his father's winter camp. If he made it, he would send word through a half-breed trapper named Louis, a man who moved between worlds and trusted neither. Clara would stay behind. She would wait. In the spring, she'd sell the homestead. She couldn't sell it right away. That would look too suspicious. She'd invent a story about returning to family in Ohio. It was a flimsy plan, full of holes, but it was the only one they had. The night before he was to leave, they let themselves dream. They spoke in low whispers about a life that felt impossible. A small ranch in Canada, far from flags and borders and bounties. "We'll raise horses," Joseph said, his voice full of a longing that broke her heart. "I know good horses. You know how to make things grow." Clara managed a smile in the dark. "And children?" she asked, the word bold and terrifying. He pulled her closer, his hand resting on her stomach. "If we are blessed," he whispered. He left before the sun was up. Clara had cut his hair short with her sewing shears, the long black braids falling to the floor like severed ropes. It felt like a sacrilege. "It will grow back," he said, seeing the look on her face. "Everything can grow back if you give it time." He was dressed in a set of Thomas's old work clothes. He looked smaller, diminished, like any other poor laborer heading north for work. They didn't say goodbye. The word was too final, too heavy. Instead, he pressed a small, smooth piece of carved jade into her palm. "This was my grandmother," he said. "Keep it until I see you again." She wanted to give him something, a piece of her to carry. All she had was the gold wedding band on her finger, a symbol of a life that was already over. She twisted it off and pushed it into his hand. "Sell it if you need it," she said. "It's just metal now." He was gone. The silence he left behind was a physical presence. It was heavier than the snow, colder than the wind. The days that followed were a blur of suffocating anxiety. Every distant rider, every coyote's cry, every knock on the door sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She played her part, the grieving widow, planning her return to civilization. She sold off extra tools, some furniture. She told anyone who asked that she was simplifying, that the prairie was too lonely for a woman on her own. Mackenzie came by twice, his eyes full of a greedy sympathy. He offered to buy her land. She put him off, playing the part of the indecisive woman, saying she needed to pray on it. She was buying time. But she wasn't just waiting for a message from Joseph. She was waiting for the ground to thaw, waiting for the right moment to dig under her own floor. The trapper, Louis, arrived in early April, just as the first green shoots were pushing through the dead grass. He came at dusk, his pack horse laden with goods, the perfect cover. He sold her flour and salt, and hidden at the bottom of a sack of cornmeal was a folded piece of paper. The script was Joseph's. It was short. "The snow geese fly north. Follow when the roses bloom." He was safe. He was waiting. She had until June, when the wild roses bloomed, to make her escape. She paid Louis, adding casually, "I'm thinking of going back to Ohio soon. If you hear of anyone looking for a good piece of land, send them my way." Louis, whose face was a roadmap of broken allegiances, just nodded. "Safe travels, Mrs. Hutchinson," he said, and his eyes told her he knew she wasn't going east. But then he hesitated. "One more thing," he said, his voice dropping low. "Mackenzie. He's been asking questions about you, about your husband." Clara's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "He's telling people Thomas owed him money, a lot of money, said he had a claim on this land. It was a lie, a dangerous lie. Thomas had been meticulous with his accounts. They owed no one." "Thank you for the warning, Louis," she said, her voice tight. He tipped his hat and disappeared into the twilight. Clara barred the door. Mackenzie wasn't just a greedy neighbor. He was building a story, laying a trap. He wanted her land, and he was willing to destroy her name to get it. That night, she didn't sleep. She lit a lantern, pulled up the loose floorboard in the second room, the one Thomas had always warned her never to touch, and began to dig. An hour later, her fingers hit something hard, a small, locked metal box, Thomas's secret. She pried it open with the hearth poker. Inside wasn't money or a deed. It was a ledger. And as Clara read the familiar names and figures under the lamplight, the full, horrifying truth of her husband's death finally became clear. Thomas hadn't just died of a fever. He'd been murdered. The ledger was a meticulous record of theft. Page after page detailed government supplies, flour, beef, blankets, medicine, intended for the reservation, supplies that never arrived. Instead, they were sold. The profits split between two men, the local Indian agent at Fort Robinson and her neighbor, John Mackenzie. Her husband, Thomas, had been their bookkeeper. The last entry was dated 2 days before he died. It was a single line written in Thomas's shaky hand. He knows. M is going to kill me. M. Monsieur Mackenzie. Thomas hadn't died of a fever. He'd been silenced. This land, this cabin, it wasn't just a home. It was evidence. And Mackenzie knew it. Clara's grief was replaced by a cold, sharp rage. Mackenzie hadn't just been sniffing around for a fugitive. He'd been hunting for this box. He thought she was a weak, helpless widow. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Her father hadn't just been a drunk. He'd been a counterfeiter, a con man, a player in a dangerous world. And he had taught his daughter how to survive. Clara put the ledger back in the box and reburied it, but she kept one page, the most damning one. Mackenzie's visits became more frequent, his friendliness turning sour and menacing. He stopped pretending. He offered to help her with her finances, to settle the debt Thomas owed him. It was a thinly veiled threat. "A woman alone needs protection," he said during one visit, standing too close, his breath stinking of whiskey. "These are dangerous times." Clara didn't back away. She let her hand rest on the handle of the skinning knife she now wore on her belt. "I can protect myself, Mr. Mackenzie," she said, her voice like ice. She finalized the sale of the land to a young couple from Missouri, the Thompsons. When Mackenzie found out, his face turned black with fury. "You're making a mistake," he snarled. "A fatal one." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a promise. She knew he would be back. He wouldn't let her leave this land alive. Not with what she knew. The wild roses bloomed early that year, a riot of pink along the creek bed. It was time. She packed her saddlebags, taking only the necessities. The ledger page was sewn into the hem of her skirt. The metal box was buried deep in a new spot, a place only she knew. On her last night, she went to Thomas's grave. She'd used her savings to buy him a proper headstone. Thomas Hutchinson, beloved husband. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered to the cold stone. "I'm sorry I didn't see it, but I'm going to make it right, I promise." She left at dawn, not riding north toward Canada, but east toward the rising sun. It was a bluff. She rode for a full day, making sure she was seen on the main trail heading for the train station at North Platte. Then, under the cover of darkness, she circled back, cutting north across the open prairie, following the game trails Joseph had described. She was a ghost, a hunted woman moving through a hostile land. The journey was a nightmare. She rode at night, slept during the day in thickets and washouts. She ate dried meat and drank from muddy creeks. Her face grew gaunt, her skin burned by the sun. She was shedding her old life, becoming someone new, someone harder. On the fourth day, as her hope was beginning to fray, she saw it, a thin curl of smoke rising from a distant grove of cottonwoods. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It could be him, or it could be a trap. She approached with her rifle drawn, moving from cover to cover like a predator. A figure emerged from the trees. It was Joseph. Thinner, harder, his hair growing back in an uneven thatch. But it was him. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "You came," he breathed, as if he were seeing a miracle. "Did you doubt it?" she asked, her voice cracking. Her legs gave out as she dismounted, and he was there to catch her. "Every single day," he admitted, holding her tight. "And every day I hoped." They stood there for a long time, two lost souls clinging to each other in the vast, empty prairie. But their reunion was cut short. As he held her, Joseph pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a wanted poster. The sketch was crude but recognizable. It was him. Beneath it, another sketch. A woman, accomplice to the murderer, Joseph Crow Feather. It was her. "They're not just calling you a fugitive anymore," she said, her voice grim. "They're calling you a murderer." Joseph's face hardened. "The soldiers who shot me, their captain, a man named Thorne, he disappeared the same night. They are saying I killed him." "But you didn't," she stated. It wasn't a question. "No," he said, "but someone did, and they've pinned it on me." The trap had sprung. They weren't just running from the army, they were running from a hangman's noose, and the bounty on their heads was now so high that every man in the territory would be hunting them. Not just for money, for justice. Their journey north became a desperate flight. They traveled only in the dead of night, Joseph's knowledge of the land their only map. Every shadow was a threat, every distant campfire a potential enemy. He told her more about Captain Thorne. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a partner in the reservation theft ring, even more ruthless than Mackenzie. Thorne was the muscle, the enforcer. "He had something of mine," Joseph said one night, his voice tight with a pain he couldn't hide. "Something he took from my village after the massacre." He pulled out the worn photograph of the woman and child. "This is my sister, Pale Star, and her son, my nephew. They were not at Wounded Knee. Thorne's soldiers took them from our winter camp weeks later. He was holding them at Fort Robinson. He used them to try and force me to surrender." The truth was a gut punch. Joseph wasn't just a man running for his own life. He was a father figure trying to save the only family he had left. His desperate run to bring supplies to the holdouts, it had been a diversion, an attempt to draw Thorne's patrol away from the fort so others could try to rescue his sister. The plan had failed. He'd been shot, and now his sister and nephew were still in their hands. Or worse. "We have to go back," Clara said, the words tasting like ash. "Clara, no, it's suicide. They think you killed Thorne. They have my name, my face. There is nowhere on this earth we can run where they won't find us," she argued, her voice fierce. "Our only chance is to prove you're innocent, to prove what Thorne and Mackenzie were doing. And the proof," she said, touching the hem of her skirt, "is right here." She showed him the ledger page. His eyes widened as he read the names, the figures. It was the key, the proof of the corruption, the motive for Thorne's and Mackenzie's actions. It could clear his name, but it was one piece of paper against the entire United States Army. "It's not enough," he said. "We need the whole ledger. We need a witness." "There is no witness," Clara said. "Thomas is dead." "No," Joseph said slowly, his eyes distant. "There is one other person who knew. The man who delivered my message. Louis. The half-breed trapper. The man who walked between worlds. He was their only hope. A dangerous, unreliable hope." They turned south, back toward the Lion's Den, back toward Fort Robinson. It was a crazy, desperate gamble. They found Louis in a filthy saloon in a dusty settlement south of the fort. He was not happy to see them. "Are you insane?" he hissed, dragging them into a back alley. "They've got soldiers everywhere. Mackenzie's put his own bounty on you, on top of the Army's." "We need your help, Louis," Clara said, her voice steady. "We need you to get a message to the U.S. Marshal in Omaha. A real lawman, not some Army thug." "And what makes you think I'd do that? They'd hang me right alongside you." "Because of this," she said, and showed him the ledger page. Louis's eyes scanned the page. He knew the names. He knew the numbers. He knew it was the truth. He'd seen the starvation on the reservation with his own eyes. "Thorne is dead," Joseph said. "We both know I didn't kill him. But someone did. Someone who wanted him silenced." "Mackenzie," Louis breathed. It all clicked into place. Mackenzie killed his partner to take the whole pot. He framed Joseph to get rid of the loose end and claim the bounty. And he named Clara as an accomplice to get her off her land so he could find the rest of the ledger. It was a neat, bloody little plan. "Even if I get a message to the marshal, it'll take him a week to get here," Louis said. Mackenzie will have found you and buried you by then. Then we need to give the marshal a reason to come quickly, Clara said, a reckless idea forming in her mind. We're going to get the rest of that ledger, and we're going to get Joseph's sister. The plan was insane. Clara, using her life savings, would buy a dress and try to pass herself off as a respectable lady visiting the fort. She would try to locate Joseph's sister. Meanwhile, Joseph and Louis would ride back to the homestead. Under the cover of darkness, they would dig up the ledger box. They would meet back at an abandoned line shack in 2 days, but nothing ever goes according to plan. Clara made it into the fort. Dressed in new clothes, her hair pinned up, she was just another woman. She learned that Pale Star and her son were being held in the laundry building, treated as servants, but effectively prisoners. But as she was leaving, a familiar voice called her name. Mrs. Hutchinson, what a surprise to see you here. It was Mackenzie. His eyes were wide with shock, then narrowed with suspicion. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm. Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. You've saved me a whole lot of trouble. The trap snapped shut. Back at the homestead, Joseph and Louis found more than they bargained for. The Thompsons, the young couple who'd bought the land, were there. But they weren't farming. They were tearing the cabin apart, board by board. What are you doing? Joseph demanded, stepping out of the darkness. The young man spun around, a pistol in his hand. Mackenzie's orders. He paid us to find a metal box. Said the woman who sold us the place was a thief. They weren't innocent farmers. They were Mackenzie's hired hands. A fight exploded in the night. Joseph and Louis were outnumbered, but they were better fighters. They subdued the couple and tied them up. They found the box, the full ledger, the proof they needed. But they had lost precious time, and they knew, with a sinking certainty, that Clara was in terrible trouble. Back at Fort Robinson, Clara was locked in a storeroom. Mackenzie stood over her, his face lit by a single lantern. He was no longer pretending. I'm going to ask you one last time, he said, his voice a low growl. Where is the rest of it? Where is the ledger? I don't know what you're talking about, she lied, her heart pounding. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. Your husband was a fool. He got scared. He was going to confess. I couldn't let that happen. That fever he caught, it was a fast one. He was admitting it, admitting to murder. He pulled out a pistol. Now the box, or you'll end up just like Thomas. Suddenly the fort's alarm bell began to ring. Shouts echoed outside. Gunshots. Mackenzie's head snapped up. What in the hell? Through the small barred window, Clara could see flames. One of the barracks was on fire. It was a diversion. It had to be. Joseph. The storeroom door burst open. It wasn't Joseph. It was Pale Star, Joseph's sister. In her hands, she held a heavy cast-iron skillet. She brought it down on Mackenzie's head with all her might. He crumpled to the floor unconscious. My brother sent me, she said, her English halting but clear. He said you were family. Come, we must go now. The fire Joseph and Louis had set was spreading, creating chaos. In the confusion, Pale Star led Clara through the smoke-filled fort. They found Joseph, Louis, and Pale Star's son by the stables. The reunion between brother and sister was a desperate, tearful embrace. How did you know? Joseph asked his sister. The soldiers. They got careless, she said. They talked of the white woman accomplice. I heard them say your name. I knew you would come. They rode out of the fort into the night, the flames of their escape lighting up the sky behind them. They were all together, but they were not safe. Mackenzie would wake up. The entire fort would be after them. They rode hard for 2 days, pushing their horses to the limit. They finally holed up in a series of caves Joseph knew from his youth. They were exhausted, hungry, but they were alive, and they had the ledger. The marshal from Omaha, Louis said, he's our only chance. I'll ride. I can make it in 3 days if I kill this horse. It's too dangerous, Clara said. They'll be watching the trails. Then we bring the marshal to us, Joseph said. He looked at Clara. We set one last trap. The plan was audacious. They would send a piece of the ledger, not the original, a copy made by Clara, to the commander of the fort, along with a message. The message would say that Joseph Crow Feather would surrender himself and the original ledger in exchange for amnesty for Clara and safe passage for his sister. But he would only surrender to the fort commander and he would only do it at a neutral location, Clara's burned-out cabin. They were banking on the fort commander's greed. He was likely in on the scheme with Mackenzie and Thorne. He would want that ledger destroyed above all else. He wouldn't bring the whole army. That would attract too much attention. He'd come with a small group of trusted men who were also criminals. Louis got the message to the fort, and they waited. The day of the meeting arrived. From a ridge overlooking the homestead, they watched. Just as they'd predicted, the fort commander, Major Croft, arrived with only a half-dozen men. And with them, his head bandaged, was John Mackenzie. They were walking right into it. When Croft and his men entered the clearing, they weren't met by Joseph. They were met by the U.S. Marshal from Omaha and a dozen of his deputies, who had been hiding in the creek bed. Louis had ridden like the wind. The marshal, a grizzled veteran named Abernathy, had listened. He'd seen enough army corruption in his time to know the truth when he heard it. Major Croft, John Mackenzie, Marshal Abernathy said, his voice like gravel. You're under arrest for theft, conspiracy, and the murder of Thomas Hutchinson in Captain Thorne. Croft's face went white. Mackenzie sputtered. Thorne? Crowfeather killed Thorne. No, Abernathy said calmly. Our investigation revealed Captain Thorne was shot in the back with a standard-issue Army pistol. The same pistol, in fact, that you used to murder Thomas Hutchinson. You got sloppy, Mackenzie. You killed both your partners. Justice, when it came, was swift. The whole rotten conspiracy came crashing down. The ledger told the whole story. With their testimony and Louis', the case was sealed. Mackenzie and Croft were hanged. Joseph was cleared of all charges. His name, the real one, was spoken with respect again. It was over, but their old lives were gone forever. Standing in the ruins of her cabin, Clara felt a profound sadness, but no regret, that life was over. Joseph stood beside her, his sister and nephew safe. What now? She asked, the same question she'd asked him months ago in a world that no longer existed. He took her hand. North, he said. We had a plan, remember? A ranch, horses, a new life. His father, Standing Elk, welcomed Clara not as an outsider, but as the woman who had saved his family. They crossed into Canada a month later, leaving the United States and its ghost behind them. They built their cabin, they raised their horses, and they found a measure of peace in a world that had tried its best to tear them apart. A year to the day after she had found him bleeding in the snow, Clara gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas, for the man whose death had unknowingly saved them all. Holding their child, whose skin was a perfect blend of the prairie sun and the winter snow, Clara looked at Joseph. He belongs to both worlds, he said softly. She smiled, a real smile, free from fear and shadow. No, she said, he'll build his own. And he did. They all did. They built a life not of white or Indian, of victim or victor, but of family, of survivors, a life forged in blood and fire, and sustained by a love that proved to be stronger than all the hate in the world. The story of the White Widow and the Lakota warrior became a legend in their family, a story told to grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a reminder that sometimes the most impossible bridges are the only ones worth crossing. If you were moved by Clara and Joseph's story of courage and love against all odds, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales that remind us of the strength of the human spirit. And let me know in the comments below, what was the biggest twist for you? Your engagement helps these stories reach more people. Thanks for listening.